With me is Jonathan Fulton, a senior non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council and a political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, UAE, whose work focuses on China-Middle East relations. He also recently edited the book, the Routledge Handbook on China-Middle East Relations, which was just published. Thank you for joining us today, Jonathan.
Thanks, Gali. A pleasure to join you.
Great. So we have so many topics to discuss, but I would like to start with a general question on China's interest in the Middle East. For years, it was common to describe the Chinese interest in the Middle East through the lens of energy needs. According to this concept, China regards the Middle East as a gas station. Its growing economic needs energy sources, which the Middle East has an abundance of. And therefore, China's interest in the region is mainly or purely or mostly on fuel and gas. To what extent do you think there's this explanation still valid? And what are China's interests in the Middle East and the region for now?
I think it's not valid at all, actually. I mean, energy, of course, is the core of what China's doing in the region. Energy motivated China to play a bigger role, I think, starting about 20, 25 years ago. But certainly it's gone beyond that. If it was just a matter of energy, then there would be a ceiling on the relationship. And I don't think that's the case. You can see in 2016, China released its first Arab policy paper. I think that's an interesting distinction because it's famously not the rest of the Middle East. It's an Arab policy paper, but in it, they rolled out three priorities. They called it the 1+2+3 cooperation framework. And number one, of course, is energy at the core, traditional hydrocarbons. But I think you can see in the other elements with two, they said they want to focus on infrastructure construction and trade and investment. And for three, it's renewable energy, nuclear energy, and tech. So when China's looking at the Middle East, they're looking at a long-term sustainable economic presence that goes beyond just buying energy and selling cheap stuff. And I think when you look at it increasingly, you see what China's been doing in Djibouti, the rumors of what they've been doing in other parts of the region. There's an increasingly strategic component. And that's the part I keep bringing up with my Emirati students, who often reduce everything to oil. Why are all these great powers coming here? Because of oil. Like, well, if that's the case, why did the UK come? Why did the Portuguese come? Everybody comes here eventually because this middle in the Middle East, it's in the middle of all these great regions. Geostrategically, it's such an important region. And for China, especially in the era of the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're trying to link markets and link societies and trading routes, you can't get to the Mediterranean without passing through the Middle East. So I think China does increasingly see this as a very important geostrategic region as well. That's common with most great powers. They see a presence in the Middle East as something that's required almost. So energy is important, absolutely, but there's a whole lot more going on than just that.
Great. So you mentioned the infrastructure, which is a favorite of mine, and I want to dive deeper into China's interest in this regard. We usually speak about the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, but within this framework of BRI, there are many more smaller, maybe, initiatives that are sometimes even more important than the grand vision. For example, you mentioned in the book the industrial park port interconnectivity, two wings and two wheels approach, which is kind of a catchy name. Can you elaborate? Can you elaborate on this relatively new approach?
Right. So this is interesting because this is basically what China's been doing in a lot of its free zones, its domestic political economy, like looking at how they developed Shenzhen from this, tiny fishing village into this juggernaut. Basically, it's just taking these free zones and turning them into the whole kit, where they've got the port, they've got the industrial park connected to the port, and they've got the infrastructure that goes with it, the highways and the residential areas and the schools and everything. So they've done this in China. They've done this, and this was through China Port Merchant. So it started as a commercial idea, and they started doing it in Southeast Asia. And in 2018, during the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, "Yeah, we want to do this in the Middle East as well." And this is interesting because the year before that, you could see, for example, in Duqm in Oman, there was talk of taking this very small fishing village and turning it into a major port park hub, energy hub. Chinese firms announced something like $11 billion worth of deals. And it seemed unusual, to say the least. But then when you look at it in, a year later in this, two-wing, two-wheel approach, you could see that a lot of things China had been doing around the Arabian Peninsula, Red Sea, fit into this framework. So, in Abu Dhabi, for example, there's been a lot of major commercial presence in the Khalifa port. In Jizan in Saudi, they've been developing this industrial park. There's, of course, the base in Djibouti, and then all the stuff they've been doing in Egypt over the years. And when they gave it this name, this, as you say, very catchy name that rolls off your tongue so effortlessly, what you see is, a commercial presence that goes from the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And of course, as you've documented so well in your work, Haifa seems to be yet another jewel in the crown, right? That what they've been doing, investing in these ports, offers a lot of the same kind of influence projection, if not power projection, commercial projection certainly, that China can go without really having much of military presence and still have a major presence in very important port cities and major markets around the region.
Yeah, okay. So as I understand it, there are 5 countries in this catchy name approach: the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, and Egypt. I did not hear Iran in it. So I was wondering, maybe, can we say that China is maybe starting to create some kind of hierarchy between countries in the Middle East? Are we seeing maybe the new policy of friends with all, but some friends are better than others?
Totally. I wouldn't say they're starting to. I'd say they're very deep in that approach. I mean, one thing that always drives me a little crazy is when people talk about China as a neutral actor in the Middle East. And, neutrality, of course, implies that you don't care one way or the other. I think China cares very deeply. With Iran, you're right. You don't see Iran in this port and park project because Iran's, maritime ports aren't that great. Mostly what Iran's had to do is ship to Dubai and use Jebel Ali as a port. Iran's commercial value to China has been, of course, very limited. And that's, of course, because of sanctions. It's because Iran is, I mentioned earlier about connectivity, about how China's connecting people, societies, and markets. Iran isn't connected to very much, in its own region. Of course, the Iranian government's a very revisionist state. It's not trusted by many local actors, and you don't get much by working closely with Iran. So as a result, yeah, China's got this comprehensive strategic partnership, which everybody got very excited about last year. But they also have the same level of partnership with the UAE, with Saudi, with Egypt, and with Algeria. They also have the next level down, what they call a strategic partnership with every other country in the Gulf except Bahrain. So if you look at the GCC, as an albeit uncomfortable group, China definitely, their interests are definitely weighted much more closely on this side of the Gulf than with Iran, with which they do very little trade, very little investment, and politically they don't engage nearly as deeply as they do with the GCC. So yeah, I think China does play favorites. I think they don't do it as overtly as, say, the US does, which actively balances against certain countries like Iran, and develops these alliances with other countries. China keeps saying, we don't do alliances. We're not going to put boots on the ground. We're not going to build a base. We're just going to be partners. We're going to work on areas of shared interest. If there's areas where our interests diverge, we're not going to focus on that. We're just going to keep working on things that both matter to both of us. And if that means we're going to be, friends with Iran and we're going to be friends with Abu Dhabi, neither one of you have the leverage to tell us not to, right? How can a country of, this asymmetrical relationship, how could, the UAE put conditions on China and say, you have to be, only our friend or else? You're talking about a $14 trillion economy. So I think China realizes, the just how deep its footprint is and how deep it could be. And I think they've been playing the region pretty well.
Yeah. As a Chinese scholar once said, Iran is our last among our friends. So maybe this sums it up. But What do you think about China's views on Iran in relations with the Vienna talks? How does China stand on that?
So it's terrible. I should be watching Vienna a lot more closely than I have been, but there's just so much happening all the time. But certainly, if you look at the history of China and Iran, and that's something I've been working on right now as a report for the Atlantic Council on the Sino-Iranian relationship. If you look at the lead up to the JCPOA, China was using that behind the scenes leverage with Iran to say, look, we want you in this. China, of course, saw itself as part of that coalition working with Iran, or working with the P5 or whatever. And there's a really great chapter. I've actually got the book right beside me. John Garver wrote this chapter that documents how many high-level trips passed between top Chinese officials and Iranian officials in the 13 months leading up to it. So China clearly was going to Iran saying, it's important to us. If you want the benefits of engagement with us, if you want us to be more than just a trading partner, then you have to start acting like a normal, responsible country. And I think that's beyond speculation, because you can see shortly after the JCPOA was signed, Xi Jinping became the first head of government to arrive in Tehran. That's when they first announced this partnership agreement back in January 2016. Now, I always saw that as a reward, that China was saying to Tehran, look, if you can abide by the conditions of this deal, then look at what you get from the relationship with us. The sanctions go away. You can join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We're going to start investing in your economy. We're going to start helping you develop your infrastructure. This bank that we have, Bank of Kunlun, can start to do some serious financial operations again. These are the things you stand to benefit from joining. Now, the issue, of course, is that the shortly after that happened, Donald Trump was elected president. And on his campaign trail, he said that the Iran deal was the worst deal ever made. And he said that he's going to get tough on China. And I think Beijing looked at it and said, okay, we could dig in deeper in this relationship with Iran, a minor middle power, not minor, but a middle power, minor global power. Or we could try to pacify, our number one trading and investment partner, where there's a $500 billion worth of trade every year. Who happens to have this global military preponderance. So I think in Beijing, it was obvious, look, Iran, we're not going to abandon you, but we're not going to sacrifice our relationship with the US for you. And I imagine the same kind of logic is at play now as they go into Vienna. You saw last year, China saying, okay, we'll sign the partnership with Iran. We'll give you a path to Shanghai Cooperation Organization membership. Both of those two things at this point are aspirational, right? I mean, they can say they're doing it, but in both cases, there's still actual operationalization that has to occur. And if Iran remains under sanctions, then you can make all the partnerships you want. Chinese companies are not going to be able to get investment. They're not going to be able to trade if Iran's still under sanctions. So I think what China's doing, again, is using the leverage they have in this inherently asymmetrical relationship, and probably leaning on Iran and saying, look, come to the deal in good faith and try to get past the obvious distrust they have with the US government after breaking the last deal. Try to come to the table and get something done, and you're going to see some benefits. I think that might cause a lot of countries in the region to be concerned. But I do think that, unlike other great powers, China has carrots rather than just sticks in Tehran. And China's deep economic interests are something that can also be used by countries like UAE, Saudi, or Israel to say, look, those partnerships are worth more to us than you are. And if you're going to mess up the region, then you're affecting our interests, like you did when you blew up Saudi Aramco, and China suddenly had to spend almost $100 million a day in extra security premiums. So I think this gives China the chance maybe to play a behind the scenes role of influencing Iran in a way that other great powers maybe couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So let's zoom in a little bit to Israel and discuss the Israel-Palestinian issue. We know that on the one hand, China is very vocal on this topic, describing the Palestinian issue as the core issue of the Middle East. It puts forward several proposals over time 4 points, 5 points, etc. And during the Guardian of the Walls operation, China was very active in the Security Council, not in favor of Israel, of course. On the other hand, following the Abraham Accord, it seems that the Arab countries themselves have a lesser interest in this issue. So I would like to ask you, how do you think the change in the geopolitical order in the region following the Abraham Accords will affect China's policy towards this Palestinian issue and towards the Middle East at large?
Yeah, so I as an Israeli, when a Chinese leader says we have a solution to Israel-Palestine, I mean, how seriously do you take that?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's being done for politics, right? It's China, again, trying to look like a responsible global leader on an issue that everybody feels very strongly about. But China has no history here, and especially in that topic. I mean, what China does, I think, as you mentioned, they were heading the UNSC in May 2020, was it 2021? I can't even remember years anymore. But whenever the last incident was. And China was very vocal in this. I wasn't surprised. China can say on the one hand, out of one side of its face, we want to work more closely with Israel. And then on the other side, they say, it's terrible what you're doing. This is, not to be cynical about it, it's politics. When China does this, I don't think they're speaking out of any conviction. I think what they're looking at is the Arab League representing 22 countries that have a vote in the United Nations. So when China says we'll support the Palestinians no matter what, first they're positioning themselves, as they have since Mao, as a leader of the global South. We'll never abandon, our brothers and sisters in the global South. And two, they're looking at, how does a bloc of Arab countries typically vote on things that matter to us? If we're supporting Israel, then we look just like the US, and then we're going to face some friction. But if we can get the support of this big group of Arab countries, then when it comes to, say, a declaration of the United Nations about Xinjiang, maybe we can expect to see a large group of those countries abstain or to write a letter in support of us, which is what we've seen time and again. So I wouldn't take it personally. I don't think they mean anything by it. I think they're just being very calculating.
Yeah, definitely. But it hurts. It still hurts, when they do that. Well, still on that, from a different perspective, I read yesterday Andrea Giselli wrote a very interesting piece about how Chinese career paths are different. And while Chinese ambassadors sent to the Middle East in the Middle East countries are specialists in Middle Eastern issues, and because they served this region for such a long time, for the whole career actually. But ambassadors to Israel are not from the same arena. Actually, they come after they serve in America, in the US or European countries, before they come to Israel. So it makes you think, is Israel part of the Middle East or not? But in the eyes of China, the thing that I was wondering is, how do you think this influences the way China looks at the Palestinian-Israel issue in the eyes of of ambassadors who doesn't know much about the issue actually?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting angle, which I didn't realize that, but it doesn't really surprise me. With China, when they look at West Asia, as they call the Middle East, there's a really good chapter actually in the handbook that you mentioned in the intro, the handbook I just edited. Andrea Giselli has a chapter looking at the career paths of ambassadors or diplomats who work in the region. And I think part of it is, again, going back to that Arab policy paper, it wasn't a Middle East policy paper, it was Arab. I think what happens is, China's still quite new to the region. It's still developing its pool of talent. And I think like everywhere, when you have finite resources, you tend to, keep people circulating. If they're going to spend the time to learn Arabic and they're going to develop a network, they probably take those specialists and move them around pretty frequently from one Arab country to another. What do you do if you're looking at Turkey, Iran, and Israel? like those are totally different instruments to play, right? So it becomes difficult, I'm sure. So I'm not sure how they look at it. I mean, on the one hand, if you think a lot of their Middle East specialists are coming from this pool of expertise that has deep experience and knowledge around the Arab world, but less so, say, in Israel, then there would come with some kind of cognitive, with some kind of biases, some political assumptions that probably would filter into policy, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yes. So let's zoom out now to the US-China rivalry, if you can say, in the Middle East. In 2016, Andrew Scobell from Iran described China's policy in the Middle East as economic heavyweight, diplomatic lightweight, and military featherweight. Do you think this description is still valid today, and how would you describe China's Middle East policy?
Well, so yeah, economic heavyweight, I think, if anything, is just proven more and more true. Political lightweight, I think you could have made that case in 2016. And of course, knowing how these things get written, he probably wrote it in 2015 and it went through several rounds of edits. And, what we've seen, I say that because 2016 is, Xi Jinping came here, his first trip to the region as president or as chairman of the party. And he went to Saudi, Iran, and Egypt, and he rolled out this Arab policy paper and put a lot of momentum behind the free trade agreement he's trying to sign with the GCC. And Wang Yi, of course, has become ubiquitous here, and Yang Jiechi has been coming to the region on and on. So I think really 2016 looks like I wouldn't say it's a pivot, but it was a point where things really started to intensify. And as we saw in January this year, when all of these foreign ministers from the region went to Uxi and met with Wang Yi. And, obviously, I think China's playing a bigger political role. I think both in its political and its security orientation to the region, up until, and again, 2016 represents Donald Trump, which of course is a period when massive shifts in the China-US relationship occurred. And that's the point I was just about to make, is that China always had this what seemed quite content prior to that to play this second-tier role. U.S. hegemony, or at least preponderance, was a fact in a lot of the region, and China was able to capitalize on that. They could come into the Gulf, or they could engage in Egypt, or all these different places that had U.S. security commitments, partnerships, or alliances, and China could come in and be an economic heavyweight without having to play any kind of security role.
Yeah.
Now, you roll out the trade war, and suddenly China starts to look at the region and think, we have deep interests, and the US is the dominant extra-regional power, and it's no longer looks like it's going to safeguard our interests the way it did before. It's also talking about shaking down allies and asking that they start paying for certain things that they didn't pay for before, or that they didn't pay enough in the US president's thinking. I think the calculus shifted a lot, and you can see that just this week, we're speaking, what is today, March the 8th, 9th? I'm not sure. Whatever it is, there's been stories in the Wall Street Journal about how, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed aren't speaking with Joe Biden as he's trying to get resolution to, OPEC plus cooperation with Russia. They're just not taking the call. Yeah. Here in the region, I think a lot of countries that have these strong partnerships or alliances with the US have been deeply worried about the future direction of US commitments. And China, I think, especially in the past year or two, has quite skillfully played that, saying, look, Wang Yi said after the foreign ministers left, the Middle East is Middle Easterners are the leaders of the Middle East. You don't need a foreign patriarch. And then like a week later, the Chinese defense secretary met with the Saudi defense secretary and made a bunch of not so veiled references to, you don't need to work with the US the way you used to. So I think China's looking at how the US has been using the Indo-Pacific to, push back against China. And China sees this pressure point here where allies and partners are worried about the depth of the commitment, and they're using that to build this wedge. So yeah, it's still a security or military featherweight, but I think that's always been by design. I think if they felt that the US is going to start to securitize the region against China, they would say, look, we do have interests. We do have not just commercial interests, and we might start to see some of those ports and parks have a secondary use. We might see Gwadar in Pakistan start to, have a deeper military use as well. So, it could actually go from a political middleweight security lightweight to, start to throwing punches a little more seriously.
Yeah, definitely the economic footprint is the biggest here, but we've come a long way from the free rider, as Obama said in the past, and China definitely has more interest now in the region, and we're probably going to see more defense, military bases maybe, and defense presence here. I have so many more questions, but maybe it is, I want to ask you a specific one regarding more the future and the present regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. We see now that the war is kind of changing China's status in the world, might change China's status in the world, and maybe change Chinese policy towards all its foreign policy actually. How do you think this will influence? You mentioned before the Gulf not responding to Biden's call. How do you think that this war will influence China's status and policy in the Middle East?
Yeah, predicting the future is great for political scientists. We're so good at that. So I think, there's a lot of reports about how that during the Olympics that there had been some kind of deal between Xi and Putin, like, don't do anything during the Olympics. But then you hear about these, this large number of Chinese citizens who are in the Ukraine who weren't able to get out easily, one who was apparently injured. And you think that China probably feels like it wasn't completely as aware as it should have been of what was about to happen. In the run-up, I kept getting questions about what does this mean for Taiwan? And Taiwan is actually where I became a China watcher. I lived in Taiwan for a couple of years in my early 20s, and I love the place. I think China probably sees the calculus in a lot more dangerous way now. I mean, it's not like everybody just kind of assumed that Putin's going to distract the world in Ukraine and then Xi can take Taiwan. For one thing, Taiwan is a much more important node in the global economy than Ukraine is. And it's also in the South China Sea where every power in the world seems to have pretty deep interests. So to destabilize that for really marginal gains, what would China get out of this? So I think China's looked at it as maybe sobering to think, okay, right now foreign policy adventurism is not what anybody's too excited about. Looking at how effectively Russia's economy has been completely isolated and how their assets have been, like the whole thing in China, their whole government's legitimacy is based on performance, right? It's such a vibrant, pluralistic society. There's a lot of people who aren't very happy with the direction, the limited freedoms that they've experienced in the past few years under the Xi government, the fact that they haven't been able to travel for business or travel freely, even pre-COVID, that things were cracking down on them in a very uncomfortable way. There's a lot of discomfort or hostility. And I think if they were to start behaving aggressively in the foreign policy realm, that would most likely be a bridge too far because, if their economy started to suffer the way Russia's economy suffered, I don't think the party could survive that. So most likely, if anything, it's probably chasing them a little bit to make them think, okay, let's not be such aggressive international actors right now. There are so few countries that look favorably upon Beijing right now. And I think another important thing, something that the US did pretty well, I think, is just seeing how Secretary Blinken kept traveling to Asia in the run-up, how he was reassuring his Indo-Pacific allies. Just kind of, I think, letting Asian countries know that they still had, their eye on the ball, that they weren't going to be distracted by Ukraine and Russia. So I think China probably saw all of this and thought, yeah, this is probably the time to just be a little more modest. And I imagine the It's funny. You and I both know Li Chen Sim, a colleague of ours. Li Chen and I wrote a think tank piece for the Atlantic Council, and it was ready about 2 months ago. But for various reasons, it's been going through different rounds and it's taken a long time, looking at China and Russia and the Middle East. And it's finally going to come out next week. But we've been watching the Olympics and the Xi-Putin meetings and going, oh my God, like the whole premise of our report is that they're not allies and that the what people project is exaggerated. And then they released this statement in early February, and I think, oh my God, we've got to rewrite everything. And then the war starts, like, oh my God, it's going to make it even worse. But I think, even 2 or 3 days into the war, you realize, whoa, this is so bad for China. And I can't see them going to the mat for Russia. I think if anything, I mentioned the asymmetry and the leverage China has over Iran. Well, if anybody's going to be a Chinese gas station, it's Russia. I think this is really going to strain the China-Moscow relationship in a way that's not going to be very comfortable for Russia.
Yeah. Well, we have this now recorded, and we'll be able to check your assessment in the future to see if you're correct or not. I would like to thank you again, Jonathan, for participating in this session. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too.
I hope so. Thanks.
And thank you all for watching. I invite you to watch the other panels of this conference and follow our publications and activities in general. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
With me is Professor Shi Gangzheng, who is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He received his BA in Hebrew language and culture from Peking University, a PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic studies from Brandeis University, and he joined Tsinghua University in 2018. Professor Shi specializes in the Middle East from the beginning of the Cold War until now, with a focus on the involvement of China and other great powers in the region. Thank you for joining me today, Professor Shi.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So I would like to start with a general question of your expertise. In Mao Zedong's time, Mao Zedong turned to the Middle East. He found here a lot of countries that are ideological partners, or let's say, or ideological similar countries. And what you described as partners that are anti-US and anti-Soviet. And I want to ask you, what are the similarities and differences that you see from that period to now in regards to the way that China looks at the Middle East and its interest in it?
Okay, so I think this is a very important question to begin with, and for sure there has been a lot of changes together with some kind of like similarities and continuation. So let's start with this kind of like changes. For sure, we can see that there has been a huge difference regarding the national power. So in terms of the material power, so that will definitely influence the self-perception and foreign policies accordingly. And also, we can see that now the trade volume between China and the Middle Eastern countries has increased like a lot from the Mao's era. So definitely, and we know that China has been the #1 trading partners for almost all the Middle Eastern countries. So I think that will also naturally bring some changes. So when you have little like actual interest in the region, you might raise some like hollow slogans and some like radical designs for the region, such as to call for the world revolution, like overnight or in a relatively short period of time. But when you have actual like huge interest related to the region, you naturally tend to have a more balanced or more moderate approaches to interact with the partners in the region. So I think this is the first point, that we can see there's a huge difference back then and now. And also we can see that, as you also mentioned, there has been some ideological changes from then to now. And I would like to point out that Mao has been in charge of the power for more than a quarter of a century, even after the PRC was founded before he passed away in mid-1970s. So during that period of time, we can see there has been some changes already within, like under his leadership. So there has been different kind of like criteria for separating friends from foes all over the world, but also including in the Middle East. So, for example, in the 1950s, we can see that the criteria is that who is the most progressive ones in the region, and by that definition, Israel is have no doubt is much more progressive, like socially speaking, than those like kingdoms and tribes in the region. And also, as you mentioned, so later on, the criteria switch to who is willing to be anti-Soviet and anti-United States at the same time, and later on, you also switch to who is more willing to be anti-Soviet. So there has been some changes even within the time period of Mao's era, but we can see that there has been China doesn't use this kind of criteria to separating foes and friends anymore. So this is, I think, we can see the first there's have been the huge change from then and now. But I would like to point out also about the continuation or some similarities in a few aspects. The first one is the ideas to revive the Silk Road. Even we know that the BRI project for now is like the actual design is raised by Xi Jinping, like in 2012 and 2013, but back to the 1950s and 1960s, the Chinese leaders has already raised the prospect that one day with the countries in the Middle East, we might revive the Asian Silk Road. So that idea doesn't come from nowhere. So this is some kind of like a continuation. And the second thing is that China still believes that a very important factors to or important for the local countries, including those in the Middle East, to have the independence. This kind of independence is not just about to gain the national independence and then you will be a sovereign state and join the United Nations, but it's a much broader ideas that you have your own wills to carry out your policies. So by that kind of like definitions, so during the Mao's era, China has this kind of idea of intermediate zone. And we can see that although China, officially speaking, doesn't use this word anymore, China still perceives that it can find some friends in this, nowadays in the Middle East, as some friends as in the intermediate zone back then. So we can see that, for example, most Middle Eastern countries nowadays, during this kind of like the Russian-Ukrainian war, they don't have this kind of like interest to join in the Western sanctions against Moscow, but they also doesn't, they don't like endorse the military actions. So this is kind of like China's ideas that you can find some intermediate zone between Moscow and Washington, and what Middle Eastern countries behave nowadays is actually matches the expectation of Mao's China back then. So this is something I think very interesting to see.
Interesting. Speaking about changes in the Middle East, maybe many people say that the U.S. is pivoting to the Asia area, and which means that it's declining or toning down its presence in the Middle East. But in the recent article that you wrote, you claim that China and the US are actually locked in what you called asymmetric competition, and that the Middle East is actually their new battlefield where they are acting. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. So I think that for sure there has been debate about whether what is the actual scenario or what is the actual situation when the United States is actually doing regarding the Middle East. Some say it is the U.S. is going to stay there, and some say it's like withdrawing the most of its power and attention from the region. And I think China is still in this kind of like a struggle to try to figure out which kind of like argument is match the reality better. So I think that the basic idea for China for now is that United States definitely having a strategic retrenchment, which means it was like reorganizing its resources. It doesn't mean that the United States will withdraw entirely and just give up the whole region. So I think that China has this kind of like ideas in its mind. So regarding the asymmetric competition, the ideas I raised to describe the relations between China and the United States, what I try to emphasize is that the relations contains both competition and some certain of cooperation between Beijing and Washington in the Middle East. And then the competition, for the competition side, we will not see the scenario like the last Cold War between Washington and Moscow, or the United States and the Soviet Union, which I will see is pretty much a symmetric competition, both regarding material power and the perception and approaches. Because I think during the Cold War era, we can see that United States and the Soviet Union will see each other as the arch enemy and number one enemy to each other. And then their approaches to the region are pretty similar. They will have their own allies and they will have their partners. And I, with my partners, will fight you and your partners. So this is kind of like a pretty clear boundaries of their sphere of influence. But I think, first of all, in China and in the asymmetric competition between China and the United States in the Middle East for now, the first difference is about the perceptions, is that when United States like emphasize the competition between Beijing and Washington, like around the world, China refused to accept this kind of like term. This is a very interesting phenomenon that we haven't seen in the Cold War era. And also when there's some occasions that both the United States and China will say that, oh, I don't want the local countries to pick a side. We are not to have this kind of zero-sum games, but this kind of like local players was like really worried. They are seeing that these two countries are actually having a competition. They are forcing them to pick a side. So this is kind of like perception, like really different from the Cold War era. And also in the article, I wrote about the different approaches that China and the United States will compete each other to using their like comparative advantages in different kind of like subjects, such as different approaches to win the access to strategically important areas, and to, for example, to find their position in the security system and military sales in the regional countries, and also about this kind of like high technology trade and investments, on and on, but also in the kind of like soft power related fields. Just like China and the United States are using different strategies to try to win the hearts and minds for the local people. So this is what I describe as a match competition between the two powers.
Yeah, I want to jump a little bit ahead. I mean, you mentioned the Ukraine war. There are actually two major events that are going to influence the Middle East. One is the Abraham Accord, and the other is the Ukraine war, which are totally different events, of course. But how do you think that these events, so-called events, how do you think they will influence China's policy towards the Middle East?
Okay, I think first of all, I think to China and to rest of all, both events are pretty dramatic. And this is, it changes a lot about the regional situation for sure, Abraham Accords to the Middle East and the Ukraine war to the Eastern Europe. I think that's also, it brings to some extent a shock to Beijing as well. But I think at the same time, I think to China, I don't think they are the that kind of like defining moments to the entire like international order. So China won't have this kind of like desire to say that, oh, after this kind of like events, we must immediately change the current approach or current policy towards the regions respectively. Okay, so we can see that China on one hand, for example, about the Abraham Accords, you will see that this is a good sign for the stability of the region. So maybe China could see more opportunities to work with the local countries if the Gulf countries and Israel, together with other countries such as Egypt, this might bring other opportunities for Chinese firms to have to cooperate in more stable and peaceful regional orders. But on the other hand, China has doubts, I would say that, still have doubts whether these accords will have like the real effects in the long run. Because as China mentioned that there has always been some unsolving problems. And then China's noticed that there has been deep suspicions and mistrust among the ordinary Arabs against the Israel. So China is like a pretty careful about not to move like too fast in this regard. So I think as we can see in the Ukraine war, that I think China will see some positive signs that, as I mentioned before, that most Middle Eastern countries that neither endorse Russia's military action nor have interest in joining the harsh sanctions against Moscow. So China will see that this is pretty close to what Beijing stands for and have some like more common ground to have dialogue with local partners, but it doesn't mean that China will immediately move fast to change its course.
Yeah. So let's zoom in a little bit and talk about Iran. How does China see or perceive Iran in the grand policy of the Middle East, and to what extent does China have influence on Iran, and is it possible for China to tone down Iran's aggressive actions in the Middle East?
Okay, so this is a pretty difficult question. So I think that there has been we can see a lot of observations, opinions about the relations between China and Iran. There are some speculations, some judgments about the future, the direction of the Sino-Iranian relations, what we will be heading to. So I think there are both positive aspects and some negative aspects regarding the development of the Sino-Iranian relations. So I think there are some, so from the point of Beijing, I think the first one is that China and Iran have some shared experience when they face the sanctions from the United States. So in this kind of like perspective, China definitely have some kind of like interest to develop relations with Iran and find ways to show to the United States that don't push me too hard, or I will ally or have deeper relations with your rival in the Middle East, then will cause you even greater trouble. So this is some positive elements for Sino-Iranian relations. And also I think that China has kind of like shared this kind of understanding about Iran's worries or mistrust or furies about the United States, because this is kind of like the deja vu of the experience of China, the PRC, like from 1950s to 1970s. And and China will understand that when you face this kind of like sanctions and pressures of Washington, you have this kind of very natural ideas to develop some kind of like weapons and this kind of like antagonist approaches, or sometimes to choose to escalate the tensions. So this is something that will boost the relations between Tehran and Beijing. But also, on the other hand, I will say that there were a lot of like a kind of like a negative issues between China and Iran. For example, we all hear about the 25 years strategic agreement or strategic deals between Tehran and Beijing. But I think to me and also to some observers here in China, I think we believe that it is basically a framework. So people will still have a lot of difficulties to put the specific projects onto the ground. And we can see a lot of cases that when China and Iran they have the desire to really push forward some projects, you will face all kinds of problems. And I think the same situation will continue even with this kind of like framework. It just expressed this desire to have deeper cooperation in the long run. And the second thing is that, as I mentioned before, that China still have concerns to go too deep into helping the Iranians, because China have good relations with basically all of Iran's rivals in the region. So China still have good relations with the Gulf countries and still have this kind of like a constant dialogues with Israel. So all these kind of like countries will express this kind of like concerns to Beijing, and then this will definitely will not change China's approach immediately, but definitely will give China the impression that I cannot go too far in helping the Iranians. This is my understanding about the situation for now.
Thank you. I want to talk about Israel a little bit, because I think that Israel is a special case in the Middle East, for China for sure. How does China see Israel in the Middle East? What is its role here, other than the usual technology and investments in infrastructure?
Okay, I think personally speaking, because I have been studying Israel for quite some years, I hope there will be better relations between China and Israel. But I think for now, it is quite a little bit difficult to upgrade the relations, the bilateral relations, or returning to the so-called honeymoon during in the last decade. So I think there were several issues here. The first is that I think both China and Israel have concerns about the deepening of their relations if possible, because for sure, China will worry that Israel will face the more scrutiny from the United States that will block any further technological cooperation, etc. And the second thing is that I believe that both China and Israel they don't put each other on the top priority of their agenda of diplomacy for now. So for China, there are a lot of things to take care of, such as the Beijing, Moscow, Washington triangle, the relations with European countries, the relations with Japan and Korea, with South Asian countries, and with ASEAN, etc. And for Israel, I believe the first and foremost is to take care of the relations with Washington, and then the regional partners under the Abraham Accords, and then the European countries. So we can see that neither China and Israel is on the top priority for now. So I think this is a little bit difficult to see a huge improvement of bilateral relations in the short run.
Thank you, Professor She, for your candid answers, for a very interesting interview. And I hope to see you here in Israel and host you here in the near future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Later out.